Hello.
Our story begins at the staging grounds of the Jedi Temple. The 501st was gathering before their march. Anakin sped his speeder across the cities and watched the LATs ferry clones out into formation. The fallen Jedi grabbed the control yoke and twisted it to the side, before landing right behind his troopers. He hadn't wrapped his mind around his own feelings about this attack yet. All he knew was that he had to destroy the Jedi to protect Padme. Despite how wild that sounded out loud, he didn't think about it. Anakin raised his hood over his head and jumped from the vessel before it even landed on the surface. He stepped through his troopers, none of them identifying him or calling him a name. They didn't budge out of formation, and the life of their souls seemed to be missing. Anakin didn't acknowledge this shift in his troopers, even though some were lost amongst his morality. He knew he should. As he got closer to the front of the formation, he could hear Commander Appo's voice. He was a quiet soldier, someone who did what he needed to make sure everything went soundly. Luckily, not a Jedi inside the temple had heard the LATs buzzing by. It wasn't exactly uncommon anyways, but the sheer number of troop transports should have alerted at least someone. As Anakin reached the front of the lines, he looked around. The personalities were dim, as if they were zombified, but it was late in the evening, likely tired. Anakin took a deep breath, not for concern about what he was going to do, but just in anticipation. He could feel his heart rate rise and spike. It felt like he was about to make a terrible mistake, but he couldn't help himself from continuing into it. He looked to Appo and told him that he was ready, which the new clone commander of the 501st nodded, suggesting that they march, to which Anakin nodded. Appo turned on his heel and shouted out a command, telling all the men to march up the steps of the temple. The company presented their arms on their shoulders and stepped forward. Almost robotically, Anakin did the same thing, a thought of regret slipping away from him as the echo of boots clouded his ears. They marched up the steps of the temple, Anakin prepared to do what earlier in the day would be considered unthinkable. His hand covered his lightsaber, but swung aimlessly the closer he got to the front entrance of the temple. Despite this, there was something else. As Anakin got closer to the spot where he last said goodbye to Ahsoka prior to their recent meeting, he could see a little silhouette wheeling out of the temple towards them. Anakin waved his hand to Appa, who raised his fist to stop the company from advancing. A group of troopers followed their commander as he joined their general to investigate this disturbance. Well, it wasn't any disturbance, just a friend paying Anakin a visit. R2 may have been Anakin's droid, but he did not follow Skywalker everywhere. The friendly astromech beeped timidly as he wheeled his head from left to right, before landing on Anakin as he swept left again. Anakin looked to Appo and the other 10 men behind him, as if to tell them to stop in their tracks. No words were spoken, but those were the orders that were followed. Anakin walked up to R2 and looked at the droid, who beeped at him again, repeating the same line of questioning that clearly wasn't heard before. He responded with a stumble in his voice. Every word was accompanied by a struggling stutter. He couldn't find the words to say to defend his actions, and R2 caught him red-handed. Though, despite the droid's attuned understandings, he didn't truly know what he caught Anakin doing. This action was clearly wrong, and it could be seen on his person's face. Hiding his face under the Jedi robes may have empowered him to enter the temple, but to do the unthinkable was something else. Skywalker stepped lightly towards R2 and kneeled before him, addressing him in a full name, and asking him to go away from here. There was no need to see what was going to happen. R2 wheeled back in a perplexed state, surprised to hear Anakin say something so insane. R2 clearly didn't like the tone, so he responded in frustration. The words spoken were a secret language between the two of them. The clones behind couldn't understand the astromech, and Anakin spoke so quietly that they couldn't hear him either. Their conversation was simply R2 asking what he was doing here, and why these clones were following him into the Jedi Temple. Anakin looked for an excuse, but truthfully, he was a terrible liar. He always had been, and now it was biting him in the back. He tried to reason with his little astromech, but the droid got closer and beeped with a hint of intensity. Anakin tried to interrupt this rebellious line of thinking, but R2 stopped dead in his tracks and stood straight up, retracting the front wheel and sifting through his databank. R2 was known for having a terrible memory bank, which was replaced pretty frequently by Anakin, but the astromech withheld some of that information from him, until of course, right in this instant. Maybe he was just a droid, but he was conscious enough to know that what Anakin was doing here was wrong. Maybe R2 didn't fully understand what his actions would be, or what they meant for the galaxy, but Padme didn't. That was something Anakin could never take from R2, because the astromech wheeled his head around and opened up a hologram. Anakin's face flashed blue as a recording of Padme presented itself in front of him. This was before their marriage on Naboo, but after Geonosis, and after another event that Anakin wasn't very privy to. Padme spoke about Obi-Wan's visit. He was instructed by the Grand Master to put an end to their relationship, and Padme admitted that she had considered it, briefly. Not because she didn't love Anakin, but because she had seen the worst he could be. His actions on Tatooine weren't just irate, but also frightening. To live with someone capable of that, to consider matrimony with someone strong enough to bring such pain to others, was fearsome. Padme could understand his reaction, because his mother was so important to him, but a massacre is still what it is. Whether it was founded in righteous revenge or self-proclaimed justice, it didn't matter, because that same power could be used against those less deserving, or undeserving completely. Padme paused momentarily, and admitted, even before their marriage, that she loved Anakin with all of her heart. She was choosing him because she believed that he could and would better himself. His lesson with the Tusken Raiders would make him a better person, a greater Jedi, and someone that could inspire others, including herself. His wife left him with a message that spoke of hope, one that encouraged him to, no matter the severity of the situation, no matter the intensity of the heartbreak, to choose better than he had on Tatooine. If it were in her name, then it would epitomize everything she stood against. Padme, through this recording, told Anakin one last time that she loved him, no matter what the future held for them. She promised that she'd be the voice in his corner, to stand with him through adversity, even without marriage. In this was a true love, one that couldn't be broken by a simple divide in their own dynamic, and with that, the blue apparition of his wife disappeared. Anakin held his hands under her body until the hologram slipped through them, and a stiff silence sat between he and the gift he was given in marriage. R2 was his wedding ring, and because his astromech was stopping him from destroying the Jedi, then perhaps it was a sign that Padme wouldn't want this either, especially not in her name. Anakin smiled and patted his droid on the head and thanked him. Anakin realized that he was going to make the wrong choice, so he turned around as Oppo asked what they were going to do, and Skywalker called off the assault. One of the men in the squad of 10 stuck up for their orders, expressing that the Jedi had committed high treason. They needed to be stopped. Anakin shook his head, telling the trooper that treasonous individuals were dealt with. His actions did not account for the rest of the order. The clone shot back, demanding that Anakin stand down so that they may fulfill their duty. Never had any trooper other than Rex called Anakin by his first name, and this resulted in a reaction. R2 wheeled away backwards, sensing the hostility in the situation. Anakin told the trooper that he would address him as Sir, and nothing else. The clone got up in Anakin's face and told him that only men willing to fulfill their duty were honorable of such a title. If he didn't want to assist them, that he was a collaborator and should be dealt with as a traitor of the Republic. Anakin told the trooper to stand down once more, and the trooper raised his weapon at General Skywalker and fired a shot. Within an instant, the echo rolled throughout the entire Jedi Temple. Anakin was alright. He used the Force at the last second to push the shot away. The other troopers looked forward and Skywalker ignited his lightsaber, cutting through the clone's weapon, before shoving him off of his feet with the Force. The other 9 troopers with Oppo raised their weapons, and the clone commander apologized. Anakin was acting in violation of Executive Order 66. He would be treated as an active threat and a traitor against the Republic. Another weapon raised, and Skywalker quickly whipped his saber around, defending himself as a few more shots blasted out. The clones either fell without limbs or without their weapons, nothing in between. Anakin didn't hesitate with his movements either. He swiftly stopped each of these attackers before backpedaling away. He yelled out at his men, telling them to stand down now. The Jedi were not their enemy, but more blasters raised, and Anakin ran, leaping behind one of the pillars as what sounded and felt like hundreds of blasters pelted the side of the thick pillar. Anakin was very lucky that these were a part of the reconstruction after the Old Republic. If it weren't for that, then he would be dead right now. The clones continued to fire, but Anakin made his own moves, rushing to another pillar and defending himself. By this point, the entire temple was aware that something was going wrong. Temple guards activated, as Sindralik set into motion one of the many temple defenses. He was able to delegate control to some of his most trusted masters, so that he could defeat the future Sith Grand Inquisitor. They would have a ferocious duel inside the restricted section of the archives, but luckily for Skywalker, this would free up the Temple Guard unit to create some chaos and assist him. Anakin leaned against the wall, and as if the noise around him stopped, his eyes closed. He realized his own mistakes in the past hour. He thought back to that hologram, and he knew in one singular moment that instead of trying to make things right by following Palpatine's orders, he should have gone to Padme's residence. He should have done that when he first heard Palpatine's voice inside the council chambers. Everything was so cloudy, and he gripped his face with an open hand. Frustration coursed through his veins. All of this lack of focus vanished when an explosion sounded, but it was a bunch of clones yelling in dismay. A temple guard gripped Anakin's chest and asked if he was alright. Skywalker jolted into the wall he was leaning against in surprise. What he didn't notice is a couple clones lobbed thermal imploders at Skywalker, and he didn't see them because of this trance. The temple guard dropped down from the ceiling and lobbed those bombs back at the clones, sending dozens of them into the air, as the other explosions sounded off in succession. The guard told Anakin to hold still. They would help him, but he rebuted, telling the guard that they were no match for the 501st. Under the mask, the Jedi smiled, knowing this, but also knowing that the footsteps of the Jedi Temple were a nightmare for attackers. It was designed as such. He waved a few hand symbols to R2, who was placed behind an adjacent pillar with an astronaut port in it. The droid followed the command, and more screams could be heard. The steps up the temple activated spikes, ones that killed hundreds of clones in one go. The rest of them continued pushing through their dead brothers and firing on the entrance of the temple, which had been closed thanks to Sindralik. Anakin turned the corner to see his men suffering. Some of them survived the first trap, and he tried to get the temple guards to stop, but R2 was willingly following these commands. He could see the moral mistake being made by Anakin by protecting these clones. Whatever orders they were following were wrong, and sadly, Skywalker couldn't be the one to see it until it was too late. Truthfully, Anakin was struggling internally, because even this felt like the wrong thing, but he couldn't accept that it was more important to defend the temple. These Jedi hadn't done anything wrong. Mace had gone too far in his own opinion, but even that event was blurry in his mind's eye. The sound of dozens of lightsabers caught Anakin's attention, as secret portals inside the overhang released the temple guards. These overhangs were connected through a series of vents inside the main complex. This was one of the Battle Master's plans, ones that Sindralik activated for this leg of the defense. With the Grand Inquisitor dying inside the temple at Sindralik's hands, he would soon be with the rest of the temple defense force, though chances are he might not be needed. The few clones who got to the final level of the temple ascension were completely unprepared for the temple guard assault. Despite the best Jedi in the Order being spread out across the galaxy, this unit of 500 Jedi were designed to defend the temple. Sindralik had trained all of them, and increased their numbers throughout the Clone War. They descended on the 501st clones and didn't give them a chance. The elite clone unit was unable to defend themselves, because of their awkward positioning. Some of the men were injured from the spikes on the steps, the others were destroyed in explosions thrown by their own men. The medics, and even good troopers without targets to hit, tended to the wounded. But because the guard unit was protecting the temple from clear aggressors, they weren't going to be merciful. It wasn't in their honor code to be. Their one mission was to defend the defenseless inside the temple, and they did that. Golden sabers sliced through clones. The fight was bloody. Some got into fist-to-fist combat. Others were killed in more explosions or cut down by seemingly vengeful Jedi. Anakin didn't commit to the combat, as he fell to his backside and held his face in his hands. What had he done? This went back to the executive office, to leaving the council chambers, to telling Windu, to even agreeing to this mission or joining the High Council. Every action he had made in the last few days left some sort of effect, and now everyone inside the Order and inside of his own clone unit had to pay for it. As he was trying to console himself, a heavy arm picked him up, without even struggling. Sindralik told Anakin to hold himself together. They had to be ready for whatever else was coming for them. The temple guard that had been by his side helped Anakin into the temple, with R2 following closely behind. Sin then joined the rest of his men, as they slaughtered the 501st troopers. It was unfair. They had the advantage, but one simple trap and a blinding counterattack stripped the clones of all of their strengths. Of course, many temple guards fell, because they were outnumbered, but they were prepared, which went a long way. Their morale was even higher, and they made sure the clones were crushed physically and morally. It was a brutal attack that cost everyone on both sides. The rest of the brawl became a blur for Anakin. The lights of the temple faded out, mostly because everything was red on the inside. He couldn't focus on anything. All he knew is that there was darkness in his mind. He felt paralyzed, perplexed with actions he made with a semi-clear conscience. Actions that made him a true hypocrite. Only now did he realize. It wasn't the Jedi way, but he slaughtered Dooku. It wasn't the Jedi way, but Mace couldn't stop the Sith for good. All of his training emerged in his mind, as if Qui-Gon himself were presenting the facts before him. The lies and deceit of the Sith had plagued him for his entire life. Surely Palpatine would promise him what he wanted, if he just did what Palpatine asked. It was the perfect plan, and Anakin was none the wiser to the grooming he had received. It was too late now. He couldn't go back and undo it. He just listened as blasters roared and gunships exploded. What he didn't know is the Jedi activated a multitude of other defenses. Among them were counterattacks made by highly talented guardsmen that only Sinjalak knew about. The Jedi Honor Guard took down LAATs and helped the rest of the temple security protect the uppermost layer of the temple grounds. The Honor Guard was different from the regular temple guard. These were the most elite temple guards that no one except for the High Council knew about. It wasn't a perfect execution, but it was a damn good one. Sinjalak led his men against the clone troopers, who without Oppo, Anakin, or their third and fourth in command, retreated. Commander Fox from an LAAT tried to regather the 501st, but he would be among the first killed in a number of blitzed LAATs. Either an honor guard would use the Force or electric judgment on a gunship, or they would use the Force to launch each other into the vessels so that they could kill the pilots and jump to the next ship. It wasn't all perfect. Some Jedi were shot out of the sky when they were going towards a gunship. A few didn't even land on their targets, and so it wasn't the greatest show of protection, but they won. The Coruscant Guard and 501st were in absolute shambles, trying to gather reinforcements, but the temple deployed an EMP. It was established over 1,000 years before, and they'd modified it and built it up throughout the High Republic, as the city built up. The Jedi used this to protect themselves, and despite the base of tech being old, it did the job and completely neutralized any call for reinforcements for the clones. The survivors of both initial attacks were left alone, without support, to retreat back into the city. The temple guards would prepare other traps as Sinjalak confronted Anakin. Their discussion wouldn't be all that great, because it would include Sin learning about the truth of Anakin's actions inside the executive building. But in concern over their sanctuary, Sinjalak believed he needed to act, because he was technically the highest ranked Jedi inside the temple at the moment. He, despite distrusting Anakin in this moment, had Skywalker, Coleman Kaj, Pablo Jill, Shot T, and 4 members of the elite Honor Guard join him as they moved on the Chancellor. Their objective was to kill Palpatine, and Sinjalak made it especially clear to the Honor Guard that if Anakin moved against any of them, to kill him instantly. This was the brilliance in Sinjalak's plan. If Anakin acted out, then that would kill 2 birds with 1 stone. Even with Order 66 in effect, they left the highly defended temple and moved for the Chancellor's office across the city. Similar to the previous 4 Jedi who entered the executive offices, they didn't hesitate in their attack on the Sith. Lightsabers ignited, and they charged him. Palpatine was forced to defend himself with his remaining saber, and the engagement began quickly. Anakin was a little slower than his peers in the battle, because, like his actions against Mace and his own troopers, it was like he couldn't stop himself. He was confused, acting against someone he thought was right, but maybe he wasn't. It didn't matter. The sound of clashing broke his lack of focus. He joined in, but Palpatine was still in his head. Despite not moving his lips, the Sith Lord was actually fighting for his life, physically and inside of Anakin's head. He needed Skywalker to join him here, so that he didn't mess this up again. Anakin clearly didn't know about the Honor Guard mission statement, so he wasn't inclined to fear turning on these Jedi, like he didn't fear turning on Mace. The weapons continued stabbing and slashing. Thanks to actually being on guard, Sinjalak was able to display his skills, switching in and out of forms as he needed. He took the brunt of the fight against Palpatine, with the other Jedi filling in behind Sinjalak. Anakin stopped mid-fight and rubbed his head. One of the guards almost swung for his neck, but some royal guards for Palpatine entered the room and stabbed Skywalker, and it reacted by attacking these royal guards. Just behind him, Pablo Jill was cut down, and Coleman Cash continued fighting despite his friend's death. Sidious held on really well, even without the advantage that killed the 4 counselors. He was a very talented duelist, sizing up Sin, Shaak-Ti, and some of the honor guards. He blasted electricity at one of them before sending his blade against Sin. Palpatine was constantly spinning around in a circle to defend each strike coming at him. Anakin, on the other hand, bodied the royal guards that stabbed him even though he wasn't clearly attacking the Chancellor. When their bodies fell, he uneasily bobbed his head from side to side. He was like lightheaded. He still couldn't wrap his mind around any of this, and it felt like he was losing control. There was a winding echo inside of his head, as if Palpatine was trying to lure him into a trance, and Anakin was fighting it with all of his heart. As he felt like he was losing this combat against Palpatine, he fell to his knees and grabbed his head. The lightsabers swirling around on the other side of the room were frightening to hear in this state. He couldn't even see who was winning. Sindralik shoved Palpatine back against the desk as Shaak-Ti slammed down, missing as Palpatine fired electricity back at her, landing the hit. But Coleman cut the Sith Lord's hand off and Sindralik stepped back before beating up on Palpatine's saber and swinging down below with the final strike and cutting the Sith Lord in half. The Honor Guard Jedi turned and prepared to execute Anakin, but they stopped when Shaak-Ti called their names. Sindralik identified that he killed Palpatine, as the others with him checked in on Anakin. His head was clearing now that Palpatine was dead, but that didn't mean he was feeling perfectly better. He remained on the ground as the others tried to help him up. Anakin was still uneasy, prompting Sindralik to order the Honor Guard to bring him back to the temple and get answers from him about this attack. Skywalker would find himself in a medical bay, forced into a medical high. The Jedi may have acted semi-immorally towards this, but they needed answers, and the Honor Guard, like the regular temple guards, knew better than to rely on their code for something that affected all of them. By using this high, they were able to get information out of Skywalker, because his own guard was down. As was mentioned before, he wasn't a good liar, but he was good at not talking about something. That came in clutch with everything he kept a secret from the Order. But now, the most damning things to Anakin's reputation were his betrayal of Mace Windu and almost executing Order 66. Additionally, they were able to learn that Palpatine had been in his head for almost the entirety of the last 2 hours or so everything Anakin faced was just a psychological torture for him, because despite him being in control, there was a voice echoing inside of his head the entire time. At the same time, across the city, the Jedi were able to play their card. The Sith Lord would have been able to villainize the Jedi, because they couldn't defend themselves if they weren't around. Now the Jedi could show Palpatine's true colors without him there to defend himself. But this came after a very important discovery, one that ripped through clone lines, just before another attack on the temple came. It was Order 150, the executive order that completely shut down the inhibitor chips. Of course, when the Jedi confronted Republic executives and senators inside the executive building, there were problems with the Jedi, like why did they kill Palpatine, or break into his office twice? This was a huge problem, and it would bode an even larger one for the Republic itself, because the war was almost over and the Jedi had just killed their leader. But that was what they weren't understanding. Palpatine was a two-faced maniac, someone who controlled both sides of the war so that he could have the most beneficial turnout. None of his act was true. He wasn't a hero, he was a monster. Without fully sufficient evidence, it would start a whole nother thing. It would take weeks to fizzle out, but the Jedi would win the case because they did end the war, though their public distrust would be higher than ever, and it was already bad before the incident, but killing Palpatine was like driving a nail into the coffin. In the meantime though, before that came to a resolution, more problems were facing the Jedi Order. On the morning following Order 66 and the eventual rollout of Order 150, surviving Jedi from around the galaxy would return. These were members who didn't die at the hands of their clone brothers. Many of them were traumatized Padawans. Luckily, for the survivors, there were more of them because the clones were no longer following Order 66. So yeah, there were stragglers out on planets across the galaxy that would have died despite surviving the initial execution of the Order. These young, traumatized Jedi would return to a locked-down temple. Everyone was on edge, but Sindralik, Shaak-Ti, and Coleman Kaj were sorting it all out. They hadn't left the executive building by this point, but leadership did return to the temple. Yoda and Obi-Wan were able to regather in deep space, then back on Coruscant. They were immediately informed about the Anakin situation, getting the full rundown on site. This created a small fraction between the two of them. Yoda was very upset, the most he had been in decades, because Anakin betrayed one of his good friends. Mace Windu died for nothing, and his death echoed the beginning of tragedy that affected several more Jedi around the galaxy. Anakin's actions completely set up those Jedi and set them down a path of turmoil. Obi-Wan could see this, but there was a deeper manipulation that they hadn't noticed, and not for nothing, from Kenobi's perspective, the Council could have been a little more involved early on. It didn't really matter at this point because what was done, but still, it should at least be acknowledged that this was a collective failure on the part of the Jedi. The Honor Guard and Terra Sanube who commenced the interrogation were split down the middle too, ironically. It created a divide between them. Some believed that Anakin, a member of the High Council, should have had the wherewithal to understand what was happening. He may have been the youngest member on the Council, but he was 23, and Mace was 24 when he joined. Would Windu betray the Jedi at such a young age? Many believed he wouldn't have. The other side to this argument was that Anakin was clearly manipulated by Palpatine, and that was confirmed by the voice inside of his head during some of these events. This was even documented well by eyewitness accounts. While Anakin never claimed to have Palpatine inside of his head at Windu's betrayal, he did confirm that it wasn't necessarily needed because Palpatine was right there, talking to him. So, the other people who defended Anakin believed that he was a victim of grooming, something that every single one of his instructors should have taken seriously. Had they done that, it would have never gotten this far. Anakin may have been able to expose Palpatine during the war, in the case that they had actually confronted this problem. This became a hot topic of discussion between the surviving Jedi Masters. Anakin was not allowed to be involved in these discussions, but he was the catalyst of Order 66, though there was a deeper problem that started to echo outside of these discussions. It didn't come from outside the temple either, because these very discussions became rumors and eventually topics of debate amongst surviving Jedi. Due to Sindralik and a number of the best Jedi in the Order representing themselves against the Republic, Jedi warriors were not near the clones. They were not assisting in the peace process. They had won the war, and they were forbidden from interacting with its conclusion. They got to make their cake and watch everyone eat it for them. Not the greatest thing ever. They were ostracized for killing the Chancellor, even though they ended the war. It was a bit sick in a way, because the Jedi weren't doing well as a result. But despite holding up in court and surviving a purge, the Internal Order was communicating about this Anakin case. It started as a rumor, before eventually being confirmed by people on Coruscant when the battle happened. Some of those were the aforementioned eyewitnesses for his breakdowns behind the pillar. So there were two sides starting to form, even though none of them heard directly from Anakin himself. He wasn't allowed out of the medical bay, so these discussions became a focus of conversation inside the temple. They couldn't do anything else because the Jedi were being targeted publicly. They were holding up in courts, but nothing was going forward, so it was just a long waiting process to see if the Jedi would come out on top. This conversation inside the temple revolved around the reason of all of this starting. As the days went by, their debates became heavier. Some Jedi suggesting that Anakin should be removed from the Order for his betrayal, others going as far to suggest that they put him in the carbon freezing and lock him away, others suggesting the death sentence for him. So in this split, who do you choose? Many Jedi respected Master Windu, and many respected General Skywalker. Were his actions justified? Clearly not, and almost everyone agreed on that. Every single Jedi believed that Anakin was in the wrong for betraying Windu, but the reason behind his actions was the debate. Was Anakin just a selfish prick with little regard for anyone else? Why did he march on the temple? But many had interacted with Anakin before and they knew he wasn't a terrible person. He clearly made a mistake or acted on impulse. He wouldn't kill the Jedi if he actually marched on the temple, would he? Eventually, these topics started dividing people within the Order. A simple disagreement turned Jedi against one another, because despite the topic of interest being so minute, it clearly affected everyone, because the Purge could have purged them all. This is because the topic realistically wasn't just about Anakin. It was about how Order 66 affected members of the Order. Those who didn't lose someone close to them were more inclined to take Anakin's side, because they hadn't truly felt the effect of Order 66. while those who lost a master or a friend were more likely to side against Anakin. With only 3,500 Jedi dying during the Purge, there were actually more individuals who stood against Anakin. A schism was bubbling, and surviving counselors tried to stop it from going further. Yoda pulled Shaak Ti and Coleman Karash from the hearings, so that they, with Obi-Wan and himself, could put an end to this. Anakin was allowed to leave the temple and his medically induced high so that he could be with Padme. This was not so he could be with Padme, but so he could get away from the temple during these deliberations. For him, so much was a blur, and he couldn't really be mad at anyone. He was still coming down from the high, but so much mixed together. He missed the birth of the twins, but he wasn't exactly upset about that, because Padme survived, which is all that really mattered to him. Even with the joy of having twins, a surviving wife, and a seemingly happy home life, he couldn't help but feel regret over his actions, especially against Windu. He did so much, and went out of his way for nothing. The entire 501st was shredded, Ahsoka and Rex were traumatized beyond belief, clones were slipping into depression with Order 150 because they realized their actions, the Republic was demonizing the Jedi, and the war was over without any hint of jubilee. Just one tragedy after another, and part of him felt like he was at the middle of all of it. That was really devastating for Anakin. He was pretty unaware of the internal debates inside the temple, so that didn't plague him like the rest of it did. But if he knew, it would have hurt him deeply. For weeks, this back and forth would continue. By the time the Jedi actually freed themselves from Republic scrutiny, everything had changed. They won, but at what cost? No longer could they attribute their success to themselves because two of their best members almost destroyed the collective order. The debates inside the temple weren't finished though. More than anything, they were more hostile now. The council lost its grip, because in these hostile deliberations, the Jedi had come to the conclusion that had the council or Obi-Wan stepped in, none of this would have happened, which did give some validity to the Jedi that took Anakin's side. If the blame was levied against the council, then in all fairness, technically, it confirmed that Anakin was groomed and manipulated, thus not making him totally at fault. But none of the words would truly matter, because at the end of the day, these were Jedi not affected by Order 66, trying to defend someone who caused lifelong trauma by acting erratically. It bubbled over to a brawl, and then it bubbled over into a skirmish. The council stepped in at the site of the brawl and stopped the skirmish, but the line in the sand had already been drawn. They had betrayed themselves, and with the war over, the peace beginning, and the Jedi fading from the public spotlight, they destroyed themselves from the inside out. Anakin, returning to the temple, would yet again be a catalyst for the Jedi. He spent the longer part of a few weeks inside of Padme's residence. They were enjoying having the twins, and preparing to return to Naboo. He was actually going to the council to resign and abandon the Jedi Order. After having spoken with Ahsoka, following her traumatic event inside the Venator, he couldn't bear to have any more potential control over the Jedi. His time with the High Council was clearly a mistake, and he needed to right those wrongs by stepping down. But despite his good intentions, he started something that needed to be resolved. When he entered the temple, he could sense the tonal change within the Order. The survivors, those who stood against Anakin, confronted him the moment he entered it. About 13 Jedi stood before him and demanded to know why he was here. A confused Skywalker tried to explain it, but these Jedi, after having watched their peers die to clones, didn't want to hear it. The question was basically rhetorical, but they didn't ask it as if it were. So, no matter what he did, he would only dig a hole deeper for himself. And with their wounds still fresh and their minds still frustrated from weeks of getting nowhere in deliberations, they ignited their lightsabers. Anakin put his hands up as if to suggest that he wasn't instigating anything, but just being here was more than enough for them. He stepped back before members of the opposition group, the one that defended Anakin, ignited their weapons. As a counselor, still, Skywalker tried to get them to stop. He tried to reason with all of them, but this was the point, and a battle began, where a survivor swung for Anakin and another Jedi defended him. The opposing sides started to engage each other. Lightsabers echoed out and bodies slowly started to fall. Blood was drawn and revenge was lurking for many of these survivors. Anakin tried breaking up duels before getting blasted in the nose with the hilt of a lightsaber. This turned him into a very unhappy person, which unluckily for him meant he pulled his own saber and countered the Jedi that attacked him. When the counselors eventually arrived, it looked like Anakin was starting a Jedi civil war, one to shred the Jedi apart and take part of it for himself. but he was simply acting more like a Jedi by defending himself and those who stood by him. The counselors too readied their weapons and joined the fight. Some Jedi were going for the kill, others were trying to disarm their opponents. None of it was pretty. Yoda and Anakin ended up in an engagement, after Skywalker disarmed another Jedi and used the Force to shove them to the ground. This was a duel between Grand Master and Chosen One. The Jedi beside and around them continued to fight. Regardless of this, Yoda attacked because he thought Anakin was an aggressor, and Anakin fought because he was still trying to defend himself. All the ambiguity about his actions against Mace had been undone by the revenge sought by those infused with trauma from Order 66. Yoda and Anakin traded blows. Skywalker wasn't a true competition for the Grand Master, especially without the dark side, but their weapons continued spinning. Anakin was able to match Yoda's speed and precision, but mastery and experience were not on Anakin's side. There was only one Jedi to ever defeat Yoda in a spar, let alone in a duel, and Skywalker would not be the second. Yoda shoved Anakin back into a pillar, and Skywalker rolled around, blocking another strike before Yoda used the Force to launch Anakin off of his feet and send him spiraling towards the stairs, where he landed. The other Jedi continued to fight, as temple guards, honor guards, and counselors stepped in to stop the fighting. It slowly fell apart, but Yoda, after getting to Anakin to force him to surrender, learned the truth. Yoda had won, but at what cost? There was no fight, there was no competition, because it was manufactured, and a typically aggressive Anakin was only being defensive. Yoda turned and looked at his order, the weight of his own actions, that of his council, and their centuries worth of failure bubbled up into his chest, and it bursted. The Grand Master staggered at the sight of dead Jedi killed by other Jedi, and he felt all of the staggering in his heart. His hand landed on his chest, and his other hand raised to his eye, to wipe a tear from it. Yoda was shameful and hurt. His greatest failure had been realized here, and he dropped immediately. Anakin grabbed the Grand Master before he hit the ground, and tried to understand what was happening, but Yoda couldn't speak. His loss was complete. Palpatine had at least won in one way. Within moments, Yoda would be claimed by the Force and die in Anakin's hands. The fighting would continue for another couple minutes before all of it finally stopped. Anakin would lay Yoda in a casket and inform the Order that he would leave. His presence wasn't worth their pain. But unexpectedly, several of those who defended him would announce their own resignation from the Jedi Order. The entire structure had been devastated. One tragedy after another pushed the Jedi into self-destruction. The Council would stand with the survivors, and after a somber and silent funeral for Yoda, those who resigned would leave, never to be seen again on Coruscant. Unluckily, and also kind of funnily for Anakin, many of these Jedi wanted to follow him. Their arguments had been proven correct in their eyes because Skywalker didn't ever act with hostility when threatened. They wanted him to start a new order, but he didn't have such aspirations. Instead, they vowed to follow him and protect him. If he demanded them to leave, then they would go. But many of these individuals, after deliberations, debates, and conflict, wanted a new path. They saw Anakin as the true future of the Jedi. While the order that remained on Coruscant would survive, it would forever be tarnished by the reputation of the Clone War and the schism that followed it. Anakin and his defenders would go to Naboo, where they would live in the meadow. Skywalker obviously lived with Padme and the Nibiris, but over the coming weeks, while he wasn't tending to his marriage or his children, he would humor these Jedi. They actually found Naboo quite pleasant and eventually found home in the natural lands, up in the mountains near the lake. They didn't build any structures, but they cemented themselves to the Force. Anakin was still hailed as a leader of sorts. They weren't fully loyal to just Anakin, but they willingly understood that Skywalker gave them a chance to be better versions of what they thought they were. None of them realized that he would have killed all of them, which is the true irony in it. Eventually, it would become a formed sect, and they would be their own unique order. This would be completed after Ahsoka finished off her initial mission to Mandalore. She and Rex would kill Maul, and then they too would find home on Naboo. The clone armies had their own dealings after the war because of 150, but the public never blamed them for their actions. All of that blame went towards the Jedi Order on Coruscant. Anakin's sect wouldn't rival the actual Jedi, but they would continue as if they were an extension of the Jedi Order. They were loyal to the Force, and by being in nature on Naboo, they were able to find themselves. Skywalker, in its truest happiness, was able to guide many of these members on their own journeys, while also contribute to his family life without interruption. It became the perfect balance for him and his family. Eventually, he and Obi-Wan would reunite. It was a difficult time, and many Jedi on both sects understood that things went too far. They wouldn't group up into one true Jedi Order ever again in their lifetimes, but it would be for the better. They were able to end the war, defeat evil, and return peace to the galaxy. That was a triumph in all of their eyes. And that, my friends, is our story. And special thanks to the patrons for supporting the channel. Smash that like button. Let's talk about this story. So, little convoluted here. I had a couple ideas going into this, and so first things first, I wanted to kind of show off Sindralik in his truest form. Sindralik is an awesome master. He kind of gets taken advantage of because Anakin shows up and blasts him, and he's like, "Oh, what? I thought you were my friend." So I wanted to give Sindralik some love there. He's a great Jedi, and I thought that'd be cool to show him off. As for Anakin, I like the idea of kind of playing with the ambiguity of his actions here, and allowing that to manifest into a schism for the Jedi Order. I went into this with a direction that I was like, I think we all do, all the what if creators that is, I think we all do the Jedi happily ever after thing. But in the scenario where Order 66 almost happens on the temple grounds, and Anakin is found responsible for it, I think it'd be really interesting if he didn't just leave the Order and, went away, but also created this divide in the Jedi Order, because like I said in the story, the people that protect Anakin, that side with him, think that he genuinely wouldn't have hurt them, so they have no idea that he would have murdered them. And I think there's a sick irony in that. And then for the Jedi that are the survivors, as I call them in the story, those guys are the people that are like, "Yo, this dude's a psycho. He just tried to kill us. The only reason he didn't is because a droid showed up." And so I wanted that kind of frustration to kind of bubble over. And Yoda's death is really meant to be tragic, but it's also meant to signify the end of the era. It's the end of the Old Republic, the High Republic, the current Republic Jedi. It's the end of that era and the beginning of something new. So it's kind of like with new death comes new life. It's like a cycle. And so that's where you get the two different sects. And that's why I also suggest that in their lifetimes, you don't see a full group of Jedi, but it might happen in the future. So I hope you all enjoyed the story. A little bit of a different direction with the whole Jedi schism, but I hope you all enjoyed. I love you all, spread the love, and always remember, my friends, may the Force be with you.